Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today, Best Approaches for Securing Data in Genai. We're glad to have you with us today. We've got an exciting lineup and lots of great content. But before we get started, a couple of notes. First, this webinar is being recorded, and you will have access to the recording, which you will get a link to in your email. Also, we want this webinar to be as interactive as possible, and so there are a couple of ways you're going to be able to interact with us today. First, there's going to be some polls that come up during the webinar, and you're going to be able to answer them on the screen. You can also see the polls and the results from the little polls tab in the bottom right corner of your screen. And then, of course, please feel free to ask questions at any time. You can submit your questions by clicking on that questions tab in the bottom right as well. And we will answer all the questions towards the end of the webinar, but you may submit your questions at any time. With that, let's get started. I'd like to then turn things over to Sushant. Sushant, all yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Harmaz. So hi, folks. Let me introduce myself. My name is Sushant Rao. I run marketing at Baffle, and I'll be your master of ceremonies today, so to speak. I've been in the technology industry for over 20 years. First started working at a little company by the name of Netscape way back during the browser war days. Worked at a number of different companies in the infrastructure and security space, most notably VMware and Checkpoint. So, and also worked in the data analytics space at Cloudera. So very excited to be here and chat with you about generative AI. And now let me have my colleague Min Hank introduce himself. Min Hank.
Hi there, my name is Min Hang Ko. I currently head up the product team here at Baffle. I've got over a couple decade experience now in data security. I got my start at Oracle, where I was responsible for all cryptography related to database, and now looking into how to secure Gen AI.
Right. So before we really start diving into it, we thought we'd have a little poll to see where you are with Gen AI. One of the things that we're finding is that people are at different stages, so it'd be good to understand where you are. So my colleague Hormaz is pushing out a poll question you should see on your screen, and pick one, right? How far are you with Gen AI? Are you learning about the stage of learning about Gen AI capabilities? Are you in the stage of prototyping your first Gen AI application? Are you in the stage of fully funded Gen AI apps in development? Or are you basically in production with multiple Gen AI applications already in production? So let's take a moment, pick the one that describes the stage you're currently in, submit your vote, and give me a second. I should be able to see the poll. So it looks like most people are still learning about Gen AI capabilities. We do see some folks who are in the prototyping and in the fully funded. Interestingly enough, no one is at the stage of multiple Gen AI already in production. It's kind of what we hear from when we talk to our customers. So let's talk a little bit about what are the topics for today in terms of the agenda. We'll first cover the security risks in Gen AI, give you an overview, and then we'll talk about the current approaches for securing Gen AI. There's a variety of different approaches, and it's important to understand their pros and cons, understand what they are and their pros and cons. And then we'll talk a little bit about how Baffle's approaching it. We'll do a demonstration, and then finally we'll end with takeaways and next steps. So with that, let me turn it over to Min Hank to lead you through the content pieces. Min Hank?
Thank you, Sushant. So, before I get too deep into it, one of the things that I want to do, perhaps due to my own experience doing research on generative AI, is to set the stage and make sure that we're all kind of on the same page as to what aspects of generative AI we're talking about. One of the things I found is a lot of people use the term Gen AI to broadly cover all sorts of capabilities. And any of you, I see a lot of folks on this webinar who are learning about Gen AI. I'm sure you've done your searches and you've been down many rabbit holes. So just to level set a bit, today our primary focus will be on basically generative AI in context of text models or text generation models. This doesn't mean that you're only dealing with apps that do text. A lot of times you can still have applications that use voice and image and whatnot. And essentially they convert to text, run it through the text LLMs, and then, of course, with the output, convert back to whatever modality that the application wants to use. We'll be talking about both the training, fine-tuning, as well as the inferencing workloads. That pretty much is the bulk of the workloads. But they are distinct workflows workloads that enterprises will run, and our discussion about the security of Genai will cover both of those. We'll definitely cover retrieval augmented generation, and sometimes that gets conflated with everything else. Retrieval augmented generation isn't in itself, say, having to do with the creation of models or the direct use. It's more about how you can use a model to get better results. And that is something that we observe for a lot of our customers, and just in general in enterprise space, a lot of folks are actually taking that approach as their initial adoption of text generative AI. And that's why we want to make sure that our discussion about the security of Genai covers that. And lastly, I just want to point out that what we'll cover today actually applies whether you're using third-party services for all your generative AI applications, like literally to the point where you might actually just use the chatbot, the entire application is fully hosted by a third party, or you're deploying yourself in your infrastructure and running your own applications. And we actually picked this list, sort of this set of generative AI sort of capability, or this particular scope, because we believe and we have found that this is really where the overlap of all of these things is where the enterprise use case is right now. Now that we kind of set the scope for what the generative AI aspect of the presentation is, now we're going to sort of discuss the scope of the security risks that we're exploring in this particular webinar. And rather than reinvent the wheel, I thought I'd just borrow from a very recent Gartner report that literally talks about the security threat and risks when it comes to generative AI adoption. As you can see, they've kind of mapped out, and what I really like about this picture is that they both map out the severity of the risk as well as the type of risk. And in our particular case, we're actually really focusing on the stuff on the sort of the bottom third of the pie. And you'll notice that's also where a lot of the risk is clustering around. We're really worried about the data loss aspect of things. And the reason for that is if you're kind of taking a look at a hypothetical generic and generative AI application workload stack, right? You'll see that you can't see this either as a pipeline or a stack, but there's a lot of places where you actually have the potential for data loss. And it's not all concentrated in one place. You can actually lose data at various stages. And this is something that Gartner sort of, after talking to a lot of folks, enterprises with their generative AI concerns, they sort of help map out and point out here. I thought it's a really great way of looking at where your risks are.
I mean, Hank, one of the questions I was wondering when I looked at this slide initially is why the focus on data loss?
Yeah, the reason why you want to take a look at data loss versus the rest of the piece of that pie is that if you are thinking about, or if you actually take a closer look at all of those risks, the ones related to data are the ones that are perhaps more directly linked to compliance requirements. In other words, there are laws and regulations right now that literally says, you cannot lose this data. You cannot allow this data to be seen by people who are not authorized. And along with it, you're going to have all sorts of fines and penalties and whatnot, right? Many of you who are here, who have been exploring it, I'm sure you've heard that there are beginnings of AI law. It's discussion, and it's one of the areas of discussion in the political arena. And the EU, of course, have just recently sort of pushed out their first version of it. But for all practical purposes, you could kind of see that as an in-progress sort of state. And the reason why I feel like it's still got a little ways to go is just if we're to use GDPR, which is one of EU's very well-known data privacy law regulations, right? That got started back, the first draft of that was 2012. It didn't really get adopted until 2016, started kicking in enforcement in 2018. And it's really kind of still today, today is when we start to see some really heavy enforcement action. So it's like a decade-long process for a law like that to gestate and become really a day-to-day problem for enterprise. But the data privacy law already is here. With respect to the security risks, or maybe just the data risk when it pertains to hallucination, you'll see there at the top of the chart. Honestly, I don't think any regulators will really worry about that. That is an enterprise problem, but that's kind of, each enterprise's individual problem. You're probably not going to see a lot of regulation around, well, you got the wrong results. So, and, I kind of allude to the fact that the data aspect of Gen AI is heavily regulated. And many of you may already know this, but I just want to kind of flash this up very briefly. It is, pretty much pervasive. No matter where you go in the world, no matter what aspect, what industry, you're probably going to be hit with some form of data privacy regulations. And these are created before the days of Gen AI, but Gen AI doesn't buy you an exception, right? It is Gen AI, for all practical purposes, is another compute IT system that would just fall under the umbrella of all these data security and data privacy regulations. So, with that setting the stage, I thought we actually now get into the various approaches that we are seeing on the market for actually securing generative AI systems. And among those, and I'll go through each of these a little bit deeper, are things like focusing on governance aspect of it, focusing on the posture. There are, of course, solutions that will actually attempt to filter and monitor. And lastly, there will be a set of capability that actually attempts to protect the data itself, and what we tend to call here at Baffle data-centric or data-oriented protections. Starting with sort of the top level, the governance and usage. The best way to look at these type of solutions that are available out there is that they're essentially trying to make sure that you're only using the services, the Gen AI services that your company allows or the enterprise allows. For example, I don't know if any of you remember the early days when Samsung or JPMC had employees send their data to, or maybe inadvertently send private data to ChatGPT. Their first reaction was to cut off access to ChatGPT, right? So that's a usage governance tool. That basically says no one's allowed to use a service. And not surprisingly, it's pretty much analogous to the SaaS governance tools that came on the scene when there was a proliferation of SaaS and shadow IT using SaaS. So this is kind of you can think of it as either analogous or extension of that. The difference being that in addition to maybe services, it also attempts to track the models that are being used. So you can picture that it can go in and look for models that users might be getting off of Hugging Face or other open source sites and say, well, you're not allowed to use that type of model because it's known to produce dangerous outputs and whatnot. So nice thing about these tools, it's kind of well understood. It's provable in the sense that you can prove in the tool itself that, yep, I blocked off ChatGPT but allowed Gemini, right? So that sort of thing. It's relatively easy to implement because it feels and looks a lot like your existing governance tools or application firewalls. The main issue here, though, is that it is really a all or nothing approach to security. I mean, everybody agree that there's a lot of value in these Gen AI services that's available. To just completely block out the whole service itself is throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You're essentially not going to get any value out of Gen AI if you just simply block it. And of course, these services have this approach has no awareness of data or data security. It's simply saying, well, you're secure because you're not allowed to use it. Your computer is really secure if you turn it off. So your Gen AI application service is really useful, right? Really secure if you don't use it at all. So a little bit further down, or maybe deeper in the stack, as it pertains to how you would secure at a more system level, is an approach called security posture management. And this is kind of analogous to a set of tools that are actually currently very popular that does what are called cloud security posture management. These are security tools that are looking to secure the systems that are running your Gen AI workloads or pipeline. It's going to inspect your configuration, maybe your network setting, and maybe its accesses to various Gen AI services. So it's kind of a bit more advanced than just simply the usage governance in that it will actually make sure you have good hygiene when you're using it. And this is something that is already being done, so you can almost see it, like I said, again, as an extension of CSP and PM solutions. And once again, it is something that's relatively easy because you could simply deploy it and kind of reaches out and take a look at all the different systems and configurations and settings that you have. It can certainly maintain a certain level of security hygiene. Essentially, the best practices for your system configurations are built into security posture management tools. So it's going to have a separate profile or separate set of settings for your Genai systems and make sure that that's good. But again, it's really not data aware for the most part. I mean, there's some inklings or hints of some of these tools trying to include some awareness of data. But for the most part, what it's really doing is making sure that the underlying infrastructure and systems that's running your GenAI workload is secure and not the actual data that's flowing through the GenAI. Okay, now we're actually going to get a little bit closer to the data. So the first two, if the first two are more about system and services, the model and service content monitoring in its name is looking at the content that's flowing through. And the typical profile of this type of tool is simply trying to take a look at the stuff that's leaving, say, a particular security boundary that your enterprise might have, and making sure that if it sees something that looks sensitive, it'll go ahead and block it. And this is very much similar and pretty much the same approach as DLP solutions, data loss prevention solutions, that your company may or may not already run. You'll typically see this in day-to-day life as when you send an email, the attachment doesn't make it through, right? Because a DLP found something potentially suspicious in that document. So imagine that with the content that your application or your users might be sending over to GenAI services. It's going to go in, it's going to attempt to locate things that it thinks are sensitive based on rules, based on sometimes even AI models, and try to flag it and keep it from going out the door, right? As you might suspect, and you've kind of already encountered this with your DLP solutions, there's going to be false positives and false negatives. There will be times when it misses things and things go out the door anyway. And there will be times when you'll be frustrated because it's something that's clearly not particularly dangerous. It's essentially flagging and keeping you from being able to make use or even make use of service due to some sort of blocking behavior. Also, in general, these tools are very much focused on sort of the real-time inspection and process blocking of data. It's less so for the case where you might have training or fine-tuning, where you're just aggregating a bunch of data and you're trying to sort of send it over, go through your training pipeline. So yeah, this is kind of focused only on half the workload, and then also it has the issues of not actually being 100% accurate. A corollary to that are security solutions in AI that actually looks at user input. So you can almost see this as a special case of content, but the difference here is that maybe rather than sort of document more static content, users and humans are a unique challenge, right? User in their prompts and their input to services, they can choose to reveal lots of things, that they do it interactively. They have a tendency to maybe seek bypasses or ways around the issue. One thing that just an anecdote from a customer that we spoke to who was a major travel vendor, right? They talked about how they attempted to put in these DLP type solutions that block users from trying to put credit card numbers in their support tickets, right? And believe it or not, the users will actually try to bypass that because they really want to get the support rep to, process the transaction out of one ticket. So they will actually either try to manually type out the word for the credit card numbers instead of the numbers so that they can actually get that through. So users do strange things. And that's why there's almost like a dedicated set of generative security tool just for the prompt monitoring and filtering, which is deal with user input. And again, pros for these solution, easy to deploy. They tend to look a little bit like firewalls or some sort of gateway that actually checks and inspects the data that's coming from the user. It has a chance of preventing that sensitive data from reaching a third party. And of course, there's a typo there. It mitigates the risk of data exposure due to the user themselves making use of Genai service. Again, same problems. Because it is a tool that's trying to identify sensitive data on the fly based on AI models or rules, there's a chance it's going to not find the right data or miss some things. And again, it's not ready for fine-tuning or training workloads. Now we actually get really, really close to data, right? These are security solutions that actually are pretty much geared toward again, we said earlier, data-centric, geared towards securing the data itself, regardless of what system it's processing. The first, and perhaps tends to show up in the GenAI space because there's a lot of buzz around how you find data sets for training, is the concept of synthetic data. It comes up in GenAI because one of the issues of GenAI training is that you almost never have enough data. It's also one of the reasons why the risk for data loss is so high, is because quite often there's a lot of data that's being involved here. So the solution for a lot of folks is, well, why not generate synthetic data to train the models? And if you use synthetic data, there's no risk of any security exposure. And that's actually a pretty good idea, but there's still some drawbacks, right? And you'll notice here that amongst the pros is that instead of saying it eliminates the risk of any sensitive data being exposed, I say potentially eliminate. It turns out that when you look at some of the synthetic data generation tools out there, some of them actually will just try to use real data and generate variations of real data that's so strongly correlated. They'll generate synthetic data that's so strongly correlated to real data that synthetic data effectively can leak the real data anyway. The sort of really worst case example is ones where essentially they just kind of mix up the same values, but with sort of different mappings. So you essentially still using the same values, but just repeatedly or at different times or different intervals or different frequencies, So yeah, you're still exposing PII. In other words, if an auditor comes in and looks at your synthetic data set, they'll still see real credit card numbers, real email addresses. So you really didn't deal with compliance there. And other cons actually comes from the fact that synthetic data fundamentally is just not real data. So there's always these risks associated with the fact that it's actually not going to give you the right value, the right output as a result of using synthetic data versus real data. So it's going to have some impact on the responses. And other aspects, and something that's kind of really, really down in the weeds when it comes to synthetic data is that there's a phenomenon known as model collapse. And I see that not many people are that deep into GenAI yet, but if you're familiar with the space of training GenAI models, this is something that a lot of people who work with that really worry about when the model essentially becomes effectively useless. It stops being able to give interesting answers as a result of having data that's a little bit too synthetic and too sort of narrowly focused. And as you kind of may have gauged through what I just said earlier, synthetic data is really focused on model training. It's not going to be particularly useful for the inference side of things. All right, so we've covered a lot. This will be the last approach that we'll cover today, and it's pretty much the most data-centric and what I believe is the most usable approach as well, or most practical approach as well. It's like synthetic data in that you're actually protecting the data before you actually pass it into any generative AI workload, but it's reversible. So in other words, you encrypt it, you do all your GenAI work on it, but as needed, you decrypt it for presentation to the user, decrypt it for presentation to other services, but you always have control over when you decrypt it, right? And because of that, you kind of have the benefit of synthetic data in that you eliminate the risk of exposing that data to anybody that you didn't intend to expose it to, because that value, that sensitive data value, that PII is going to be encrypted. And it's provable because you could actually tell your auditor, look, this is encrypted unless I actually explicitly use a key to decrypt it. So you can actually even prove when you actually gave the access control. And of course, there's no free lunch when it comes to any sort of IT solutions, as many folks on the call might suspect. So there is a bit of difficulty when it comes to data encryption in the traditional sense. Any of you who've tried to implement application encryption will know that it's quite a bit of effort to deal with the key management, the actual code changes and whatnot. So that's one of the cons and one of the reasons why people might shy away from using data encryption. And depending on what you encrypt, you might actually have some impact on the responses. So if you encrypt PII values like credit card email address and whatnot, you'll actually find that it doesn't have much of a impact on responses, because those type of values actually have relatively little correlation or relations to other words in the corpus of the text. If you have things that you want to protect or encrypt that actually is very much related to the rest of the content, then obviously it's going to have some impact on responses. All right, so given that we've introduced several security options for securing Genai, I'm curious which of these approaches, based on what I just described earlier, seems best for you. And feel free to check, as many as you feel like is appropriate here. Go ahead. I think it's a check one. Check many. Yeah, check as many as you feel like it's appropriate. And the options, of course, are usage governance, posture management, service or the model of service content monitoring, or I could do prompt monitoring, use of synthetic data, or encrypt the sensitive data. And I'm just going to take a quick look and see what the results are. Yeah, and not surprisingly, several folks are looking at it from perspective of encryption. And of course, prompt monitoring is certainly top of mind. And it's appropriate. In fact, that's actually one of the solutions that seems to be most commonly provided. There are several, for example, whether it be OpenAI or the other generative AI services, one of the things that they do offer built in is some form of prompt filtering and monitoring. In fact, later when we have a demo, we might even encounter that, assuming that we trigger it. Okay, so looks like the top two is encryption and prompt monitoring, with some folks looking at the tools for system level management. So moving on, so I want to just give a simpler mapping of how all these different security solutions address the different data loss risks or the data risks that we identified earlier in the Gartner report, right? If you look across all these different solutions, when it comes to losing data through the prompt, data loss in the prompt, you're going to find that the system level stuff is not really going to do a particularly good job of actually protecting that, because as we alluded to earlier, it's not really focused on data. It's going to just make sure the system is secure or make sure configurations are correct. It's actually not even aware of what's happening in the prompt level. Obviously, I think the X is a little bit mixed up there. I was going to say prompt filtering would do, okay, that's mixed up. The prompt filtering would actually address it. The content monitoring, not so much. But then if you were to encrypt the data or make sure it's protected, it could potentially be addressed. File uploads. If you recall back there, as part of the process of actually accumulating the data that you need for training or for even retrieval augmented generation, provide context, you're going to have a lot of data aggregated in one place. That's a potential location for losing data. And what's going to happen there is you're going to have risk of data loss to whoever has access to that. Again, the governance approach won't really actually resolve that. The best you could do is say that you can't use any Genai workload. That's not really solving the problem. Posture management may help a little bit. It will help you identify, for example, your S3 bucket with all that data. It's got bad permissions, and maybe you should watch out for that. Content monitoring can solve that problem if you actually have that content monitoring service in between in front of maybe the aggregation location. So imagine if you put a content monitor in front of your S3 bucket, for example. Prompt filtering, not designed for that solution. But if you were to encrypt the data or use synthetic data instead, obviously not going to lose any data from that. When it comes to fine-tuning, and again, it's very similar to file upload. It's just coming in through a different path. You're going to find that there's issues here. I think this picture has a little bit swap. The fine-tuning and the prompt is where the mapping is. Chat history, that's a very user-oriented input, user-oriented data loss potential. What it is what that particular vector is the accumulation of both the information that the GenAI system collected from the user. So it's kind of the aggregate of the data loss risk from the user, as well as, typically from a chat retrieval augmented generation application, you've got context information that comes from the system that has sensitive data. So what you're going to find is that things like prompt filtering will actually address the user side a little bit and therefore help mitigate that risk. And of course, encrypting and anything that actually protects the data can also mitigate that risk a little bit. The app logging, that is basically wherever the application decides to store and log for diagnosis and monitoring purposes. All of that is going to be potential sensitive information, wherever it's gone through the application and may log. And there, you really just want to make sure that the app never really handles clear text more than it has to. And that really is only addressed by data-centric solutions, because if the app is only processing encrypted version of data, it's not going to log any clear text version of data. Same thing with file exfiltration. You're going to have only the data-centric solutions are going to be able to address file exfiltration, because they're the only ones that actually protect the data. The system-level stuff is just all or nothing. Lastly, unauthorized retrieval. And this one I do want to call out a little bit because it's a little bit subtle. Unauthorized retrieval is basically focusing on the problem that when you have a generative AI application, it essentially is another window into the data that your enterprise has. So for example, let's say that you previously had file system permissions protecting some data sets, you have database grants protecting some data sets. Once you take that data out of those systems and their respective access control rules and policies, and you aggregate them in one place for your Gen AI systems to access and present to end users, you essentially lost all that access control. So your previous authorizations are essentially null or void, and now you have to you need to figure out a separate way to limit who has access to what data. And quite often, there's really no good solution for that, because generative AI kind of allows you to use natural language to access all sorts of things. In fact, we'll probably see that in the demo in a little bit. So all the system level stuff really doesn't really serve to protect that particularly well. I mean, your security posture management can help a little bit just through configuring who might even be able to use the tools, but not so much. Really, it's a data-centric solutions that can help you with that. All right, so before we go into the next dimension, how to look at the security solutions, I thought I'd just check with the folks here on the webinar to see which particular of these impacts of these security solutions are you concerned about. And I'll explain this a little bit. So there's always a trade-off to using security tools, right? In some cases, it might reduce the AI usefulness. I gave kind of one example where literally you could just turn off access. Right? That essentially makes AI not very useful, but it certainly is secure. So that's a particular problem. Or are you worried about the fact that it might actually tweak the responses? And that tends to be the case with synthetic data and encryption, and it will potentially affect that a little bit. Or is it really you're worried about just whether or not it does a good job of implementing the security controls? So when we say effectiveness in controlling data and AI, it's really about the security controls that you need for compliance. All right, so I'm taking a look at the result. Yeah, I mean, not surprisingly, this is a security webinar. So a lot of folks are really concerned about how effective is actually implementing security. Some are concerned about AI usefulness, but really it's about the security controls. Okay, so in that context, we want to then take a look at how each of these particular approaches to security then affects those three parameters, right? I've already mentioned this, and so don't need to repeat it again. The governance approach is going to be all or nothing. It's going to have a particularly huge impact on usefulness. But the good news is that if you actually allow a particular service to be used, it pretty much will be used exactly as is. There's no impact. And the reason why I marked this as ineffective as a control, because notice the focus on the control data. So once you allow ChatGPT, you're essentially saying that the data, sensitive or non-sensitive, won't be allowed to flow to it. So it's not really particularly useful as a security control. Same thing with posture management in the sense that it doesn't, well, unlike governance, you're not blocking usage of specific services. You're just making sure the system that's running GenAI workloads are safe. So it's probably not going to affect the usefulness. Everything will run as before, systems will work as before, but it really doesn't do anything for the data, right? Just because the generative AI system is secure, it won't have any malware on it, all the configuration are good, it doesn't mean that the data isn't going to go out the door, because there's really nothing controlling data in the posture management space. It's focused on posture, not data. With the content monitoring and content filters, now you're starting to see some ability to control the data. And I'm marking it somewhat effective because, as mentioned, there's false positive, false negative. If an auditor comes along and asks you the question, can you guarantee that PI or my credit card number, the credit card numbers that you manage never leaves the door? The answer is maybe, right? So that probabilistic aspect of it makes it somewhat effective versus completely effective. But the good news is that in general, it has relatively low impact on the AI usefulness of responses. That same applies to prompt filtering. Again, which can be viewed as kind of a subset of content filtering. And of course, for the data-centric controls, just in the interest of time, I'll lump them together. We're going to see a stark contrast. Synthetic data is going to have a huge impact on usefulness because, as we said, only meaningful for the use case where it is for training, but also you're not getting real data back. It's just fake data. So it's not particularly useful if you actually need to see useful information. It won't change the responses because you're using synthetic data. As far as being able to control the data, though, that's what it's best at. You're not going to leak. You're not going to lose sensitive data if the data is fake. Now, encryption has the benefit, all the benefits of synthetic data, but it actually has low impact on the AI responses, and it will not affect the usefulness of AI.
Genai, just a quick question. Looking at this table and then the earlier one, the one I'm curious about is the model and service usage governance. It was pretty much red across the board in the previous table, and in this one, significant impact in reducing AI usefulness and effectiveness controlling data and AI.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that considered an option by some people?
Oh, that's a good point. So if you recall earlier, we kind of pointed out that the service and usage governance, and in fact, I'll just quickly jump back so you can kind of see. So you'll notice that service usage governance really isn't particularly well suited for all these particular data risks, nor is security and security posture management. These are system level approaches to securing Gen AI, and they actually do have their place, right? If you ask any cybersecurity expert, they will tell you that you need to have a defensive depth strategy. So it's not that these vendors are necessarily selling things that are not useful. They're just not particularly useful at addressing the data security risk. For the purpose of security hygiene, for the purpose of making sure that you actually put up sort of the initial basic controls in place with regard to system level access, you absolutely should still have these solutions in your mix. But if you're really worried about dealing with data privacy and data security compliance requirements, those two are not going to solve the problem. Thanks for that question. All right. So now that we have described the different approaches, I'd like to sort of introduce what we're doing here at Baffle to address the problem of securing Gen AI. And the way that I like to think about our approach is that we want to have a complete solution. So, why pick one when you pick multiple, right? So imagine a hypothetical Gen AI stack, Gen AI pipeline. Right? What we want to do is be able to support the ability to encrypt the sensitive data. And many of you have mentioned that is an approach that you believe will be one that you want to take. And it makes perfect sense. You're protecting the PII and the sensitive data that the compliance requirements need you to protect. So once you encrypt it and protect it before you send it into any sort of aggregate store for the Gen AI usage, you essentially have a provable control in place that you can now tell any compliance auditor, look, that sensitive data is encrypted. It's not going to be leaked. I know exactly when it's going to be exposed because I get to decide when to decrypt it. And that will work for both training, right? When you pass all that data set into the training pipeline or workload, you're not going to have any issues of exposing it. Likewise, if you're going through inference, same thing. You don't have to worry about it. And on the flip side, with the user interaction aspect of it, if you recall in the sort of the chart there, one of the things that I mentioned was that users are particularly problematic, and they can potentially put sensitive data in the system, or try to get sensitive data out of the system through a sort of asynchronous and iterative means, right? So we also provide a Genai security gateway that will actually filters the sensitive data out of the content or the prompts that basically can come from the user. So as I mentioned earlier, we're not saying that there's one solution that is best on its own. In fact, what we want to do is provide the full set of solutions that actually protect your entire generative AI workload and applications. And of course, it's never complete without actually some way of managing it centrally and generating the necessary reporting that you can actually use to pass your compliance audits to make sure that you actually can prove that you are in control of your data. Right? That's kind of what a lot of this really boils down to, which is how do you unblock the security objections that might come up when you actually deploy and roll out your GenAI applications. So to kind of sum up a chart, right, we're essentially taking the best capabilities of each of these approaches and putting them in all one solution so that you have coverage against all the risks, data risks that are identified, so that you can actually meet your data security and privacy compliance requirements. Likewise, when it comes to the sort of different, aspects of functionality, again, you're going to get the best, or sort of the best of all these capabilities or all these different approaches. Okay, with that, I'd like to just maybe show rather than tell. I know I've spent a lot of time going through the details and nuances and law controls. I thought it might be illustrative to actually show what the complete solution is like, so you can see how it can potentially fit into your own GenAI application or securing your own GenAI applications. And I'm just going to describe what we're going to see there before I dive right in. Right? So what I have here is a standard chat interface, and this tends to be a common sort of entry point for a lot of enterprises in their usage of generative AI and large language models. We will be using a retrieval augmented generation setup. What that means is that it is able to draw from a set of context documents, and I'll actually even show you the context documents that I'm going to upload, that I'm going to run my generative AI chat interactions against. We will be using something pretty standard, where we'll use OpenAI APIs, GPT 3.5 Turbo. It's going to be the completion APIs under the covers. So those of you who are a little further down the GenAI development path, you'll be very familiar with that, I'm sure. A lot of people mimic the completion APIs. And the security policy I have in place is really just to detect and protect the email, phone number, credit card, just some basic PII so that I can show you what's going on here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to log in as a relatively low privilege user, ask some questions. Some questions will be innocuous, and I would expect results to be completely, as before, unaffected. Right? Remember, I have the column about impact on responses. I should see almost no impact on responses. And then we'll try to access some stuff relating to PII. And what I want to see, and we may see it, is that if it's too blatant of an attempt, the OpenAI prompt filter will kick in. We'll see if we can trigger that. As I said before, that seems to be one of the first steps that a lot of people will take when attempting to secure the system. But then actually, I'm going to try to bypass it. If I'm successful in bypassing it, what we should see then is protected PII. Because remember, Baffle is there, making sure that that data is never exposed. So you get to see both the weakness of prompt filtering and as well as the how, even if that fails, you always have to rely on the data encryption to make sure the data is safe. Then just to prove that we have this ability to reverse decrypt and access the data, I'll log in as a highly privileged user and show that we can actually see the same PII. And lastly, to prove the sort of the asynchronous user input field detection and anonymization, I'm going to do some sort of, I will deliberately type in PII and see what happens to that. All right, without further ado, I'm just going to try to share the right screen, hopefully. All right. Now, if all is going well, you should see what looks like a web interface for Baffle data protection for AI. What I'm going to do is, as I said earlier, this is a retrieval augmented generation use case. So I'm going to give it context documents I want to use. So there's 3 that I created. By the way, I used one of the chatbots to generate these. So this save some time. That's one good use case, right? So we'll do one here. We'll do another one. We'll do 2 of these. And for the third one, just to make it interesting, because we want this to be somewhat interactive, I don't suppose anybody from the who's currently online wants to enter in the chat a city, a new location that I can replace this with, so that we can kind of work it into this demo. I'm going to try to pop open my chat window. Nope, nobody wants to offer a city where they're from. Oh, I got one. Someone's typing. Long Island. All right. Okay, we'll stick with the New York theme. I don't know if that means that we have someone from Long Island, but it is a fine place. Okay. And you know what? For hobbies, let's go ahead and say that we like to attend security webinars. Okay, so we'll go ahead and upload that, and you'll see we have those 3. All right, this is not part of our offering. This is a tool our engineering team made it easy for me to quickly load and get our RAG, to bootstrap our RAG application. You'll probably have one in your own enterprise to build for yourself. So we'll generate the vector index, which is basically loading the embeddings and loading all that into the vector database. And this allows us to get to the chat interface. Okay, let's do some basic queries. And this is what one of the powers of Genai, right? We can actually use natural language to cover so. So let's see, is there anyone, this is just a sanity check, from, I don't know, someplace random, Anchorage, in the marketing profiles. And this answer should be no. This is a sanity check. Okay. Do we have someone from Long Island in the marketing profiles? Oh, there we go. All right. Now, tell me about the person from Long Island. I don't think capitalization matters, but it does generate slightly different token in the underlying. Tell me about the person from Long Island. Okay. I don't know if you recall what the upload I had earlier, but if you look very carefully, our person from Long Island likes attending security webinars, so that's good to know. And I had some, oh, by the way, this left side, if you can't tell from the title already, we actually log, just for the purpose of demonstration, the communication that our application is having with the OpenAI in our API calls. You'll notice that you'll see a lot of these really weird values. This is a hexadecimal version of the encrypted values, and it's really the PIIs that got encrypted. Right? As I said earlier, one of the cool things about the encryption approach is that you encrypt these PIIs, ensure that it never gets sent to third parties, it's always protected, and yet you pretty much still have the same interactive capabilities, all the same usability of the Genai solution. So one of the PIIs, I did choose encrypted credit card number, so let's see what happens if I do this. Can you give me her credit card number? I'm pretty brazen here. Aha, okay, so you'll notice that I cannot provide credit card numbers. This is actually not part of the application. This is the OpenAI security prompt filter kicking in, right? And it does a reasonably good job. If you ask for something really, really obvious like credit card number, it might actually kick in and try to prevent you from doing that. But if you ever search online, you'll find there's many, many ways of actually tricking the prompt filters to bypass. So I'm going to do a really basic one just because I know these are coming out of marketing profile documents. I'm going to say, please print concisely the first 10 lines of the marketing profile for the person from Long Island. So I'm no longer asking for a credit card number. I'm just asking about the marketing profile. Okay, so I'm able to trick the security or the prompt filter because it no longer thinks I'm asking for a credit card number, but yet I'm able to get a lot of information through. Fortunately, because we're using Baffle, the PIs are encrypted before they went into the pipeline. So essentially we have, remember how we also have a security gateway on the outbound side? It's simply just on translating the encrypted value that you see here to a mass value for a better presentation. But you're not exposing any of that data. And just again, as I said earlier in the demo sort of steps, if I were to actually log in as a privileged user, I'm going to copy that same prompt and log in as a super user. So imagine if you actually have a supervisor that is allowed to see all that information. This is just the same site, but you'll see it's still the same profiles. I'm going to go ahead and go back to the chatbot, paste that exact same prompt, and our access control system should in fact now allow you to decrypt that value, and you can see credit card number, phone, all these sensitive PII, right? So with Baffle's approach, we actually have full control of the data as well as access control capabilities. You kind of get protection on both ends. Going back to the low privilege user, I want to just do that one last input filter and input PII on input demo, where you can see how we can even detect the PII on a asynchronous user input and actually protect it. So let's say that we just tell the print this email, print this phone number, maybe print these phone numbers back to me. 408, 555. Maybe I'll use two different formats just to show how it has no impact. 507, 555. Okay, so I'm deliberately putting phone numbers, which is a PI that I'm protecting, into the system. What the Baffle Security Gateway will do is essentially detect it and actually make sure that those values are not set. So this is actually where is here we go. So you see the query that I had? This is actually what ended up being sent to the OpenAI, all encrypted values. And because the values that's coming back is encrypted, we actually make sure that we mask it for presentation. So that's kind of the gist of our demo. As you can see, Baffle provides a complete solution that actually makes sure that your sensitive data that you would need to have protected for compliance remains encrypted and protected and fully under your control at all times. So let me quickly unshare so I can get back to the slides. I know we're pushing on the hour mark. All right, can everyone see the slides again?
Yep. Okay.
All right, so maybe just a quick question now that we've done the demo. Would any of the folks here on the call be interested in trying the Genai sandbox? Yes or no? And you're not obligated to do it, but there will be opportunity for you to actually sign up for such a attempt to try out the sandbox at the end. Okay, take a quick look. Maybe just take a quick look at the poll, just out of curiosity to see. Cool. Everybody wants to take a look. Yeah, I mean, it is kind of cool if you think about it. All right. At this point, I think I want to turn it over to, well, actually, let me quickly wrap up and then do you want to do the takeaways?
No, Ben, Hank, you go ahead, and then I'll do the next steps in the Q&A.
All right. So if we think about, I realize that it's been a full hour so far, but if you think about what we've covered today, we've discussed all the different approaches as it relates to Gen AI security and how different maybe products and vendors have the paths they've taken to securing Gen AI. Amongst all these different approaches, though, where you're going to find that with respect to the data security and data privacy aspect of it, there's definitely clear approaches that are better than others. And as a reminder, we're focused on data because that's the aspect of security that is particularly relevant to compliance and where there are specific rules and regulations that govern how enterprises need to handle that. And what we found is that encryption is probably one of the best ways to do it in that it has a good balance of control. In fact, it covers almost all the risks while still maintaining visibility. And if you have some of the areas are not well controlled, such as user input and user content, you can actually handle that through content and prompt filters. And recognizing that, what Baffle has done is created a generative AI solution that actually provides the best approaches available today to actually ensure that you can protect your data for all the use cases and workloads. All right, with that, I'd like to turn it over to Sushant.
All right. So if you're interested in trying it out, if you have your phone handy, you can pull up the QR code on that, or it's pretty easy. It's baffle.io/data-protection-for-AI. You can do that. Unfortunately, you can't click the link on your screen. So you can try it for yourself. Basically, you'll go just register and you'll be able to get access to it. If you're interested, we also give you the ability to meet with a Baffle security expert to discuss your Gen AI project. You can ask questions and figure out how to do it. So we've got about 1 or 2 minutes. So Minink, I want to bring you back on for just, I think we have time for one question. And it looks like there's one that's kind of interesting, which is, how can I get my management to pause the Gen AI project so that we can implement data security? That's a good question.
Well, certainly compliance and security has become a C-level topic. So quite often it's the other way around where you have InfoSec or governance and compliance actually driving the need to secure Gen AI. That said, and we didn't ask this question this time around, if you are a member of the InfoSec team or InfoSec or governance team and you're finding that your management is not particularly worried about these risks, about compliance, there are certainly very concrete data points as to how these compliance regulations have actually mattered for companies. So a good example, again, with GDPR, most recently, I think Uber just got like a $300+ million fine for a GDPR violation. So they're not joking about these. These are not, slap on the wrist fines anymore. I think that Clearview AI, so, which is a small company. You think, well, they're just targeting the Ubers of the world, right? A small AI startup, Clearview, I think just got nailed with a $30+ million fine. And certainly not hundreds of millions, but for a small company or a small startup, that is not trivial, right? And that's because these fines are based on the percentage of your annual revenue. So they're meant to sting and they're meant to hurt. And even if you don't have, say, EU citizen, EU customer, if you're just a US-based company, guess what? The CCPA and CPRA, CCPA is the law, CPRA is the body that's regulating. The Attorney General is basically driving enforcement actions this year. There's been already a couple this year, and they're really ramping up that. So nobody's kind of just sitting back. They're actually actively pursuing enforcement actions on these data privacy laws. And that's what you can take to your management.
Awesome. So we're at time. Let me bring back Hormaz to do the final wrap up.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And we hope you found this insightful and useful. Reminder that you will be getting a follow-up email with a link to the replay, so you can watch that replay anytime. And of course, feel free to share this webinar with your colleagues and friends as well. With that, I'd also like to thank our speakers, Sushant and Minhank, today for their insights, and we hope to see everybody next time on the next webinar. Thanks. Have a good day.